Welcome back. Today we've got a twofer. We've got Margo Lamb from Emerald Coast Hospice, and we just spoke about Camp I Believe, held each year in Marianna, a bereavement camp for young children. And now we're going to talk a little bit about volunteerism. You know, Emerald Coast Hospice is one of many service organizations throughout our region. Without volunteers who would not be able to exist, let alone do the great works that they do. You know, we take for granted all the volunteers. When we come back, we're going to talk to Margo about how important those volunteers are to, in this case, Emerald Coast Hospice. But at the end of the day, really not being able to accomplish nearly much at all of what they do every day, all year long, without those very dedicated volunteers who want nothing other than to be of service. And many times we can fulfill or enhance our lives simply by having that service mentality, trying to do something with no gain as a result, just doing something unselfishly for somebody else, random acts of kindness, if you will. In this case, this is not random. These are people who have dedicated blocks of time to working events and on a daily basis work with Emerald Coast Hospice as volunteers. When we come back, we're going to talk to Margo about the importance of volunteers, and we will be right back. Welcome back. Margo Lamb from Emerald Coast Hospice. Thanks for sticking around.
Yeah.
You know, we briefly touched on volunteerism when we talked about Camp I Believe and the fact that you do have a lot of volunteers that are part of that and without whom you would not be able to do the event. Mm-hmm. We've had this conversation before. I know that you head up the volunteer segment of Emerald Coast Hospice. Would you say safely that 90% of the hours that are put in with the works that Emerald Coast Hospice does are probably volunteer hours? Or is that number anywhere near close?
It's probably a little high, but I will tell you that without the volunteers, I know that it would be a completely different dynamic of how the office is run and how the patients are served. I feel like the volunteers have a really, really large, huge connection with the patients. When they're doing the patient care volunteering and they're going and they're sitting in the homes, I think they just bring a different dynamic to that situation. I think that the volunteers are able to connect with the patients or the caregivers on a different level than the clinical, staff does.
Don't misinterpret my words, and not taking anything away from paid staff.
Right.
At the end of the day, though, that paid staff is there for a paycheck.
You're right.
That doesn't mean they're not passionate about what they're doing.
Right.
That they're not in it with their whole being to help that person. But they are still there because it's a job.
That's right.
And they're there on the days they don't feel well and the days they have their own crisis they're trying to deal with, but they are still there at work. Sometimes not up to full 100% of what they are capable of. A volunteer only volunteers and comes when they're able and when they're of that mind that is that service mentality. So I would have to argue that a volunteer is about as pure as it gets.
It is.
When you talk about the services rendered. You guys don't do a lot of fundraising, but you are at a lot of community events, and then you provide the services which you provide. How many volunteers, roughly, would you say, just a ballpark number, do you think that Emerald Coast Hospice has between Washington and Jackson County?
We're in the range anywhere active, anywhere between 35 to 50. It really depends because it's seasonal for some. And sometimes we have more, sometimes we have less. It's funny, when I took this job a couple years back, I thought my goal is to get X amount of volunteers. And I want it so that I have a big pool of volunteers to pick from and so that I always have someone available. Well, my mindset has changed. Most often, everyone that walks through our door is there as a volunteer for the right reasons. But every now and then you get someone that you're not really sure what their reason is for volunteering or for wanting to because they don't really follow the guidelines and the boundaries. Boundaries are a really big deal when it comes to volunteering, especially if they're doing patient care. And so now I've changed my mindset, Paul, and I'm more about the quality of the volunteers that we have are exceptional, and not one of them has ever said no to me that really is truly there for the right reasons. I mean, you can call them up and ask them to do something, and if they can't do it that day, they'll find another day that they can, because they are that devoted and that pure to what they're doing. I have a volunteer over on the Bonifay side that she gives 100% all the time, and she doesn't want for anything other than to know that she has helped that family. And I'm just touched and just driven emotionally by her commitment to our patients and families. She is a patient care volunteer, but I know if I asked her to do something for me in the office, she would show up tomorrow without any questions and say, okay, I'll do what you need me to do. It's remarkable. And so, yes, we need a lot more volunteers. We can always use more volunteers. And so we're always constantly trying to recruit for them. But I do think that the main point is finding the good quality volunteers that really are here to do it because they feel a calling to it.
We live in a loving, giving community. And when I say giving, I've seen many instances where I know people gave when past the point that it started to hurt. When people are in need, if I were in need, I would want to be no place else than in this general area that we live in.
Right.
Because we're surrounded by that giving, loving community. Around 2005, we had the bubble burst financially. We actually had a perfect storm. We had 2 hurricanes back-to-back in the Gulf. We had the oil spill off of the Gulf Coast, and we had the financial crisis where the bubble burst. We found at that time that a lot of volunteerism dropped off. By default, and by the nature of volunteerism, most of your volunteers are going to be more mature adults, most of the time retired from something else, and they are a little bit older. Consequently, a lot of them are on fixed income.
Correct.
When the bubble burst, a lot of financial investments were impacted, and a lot of people had financial strain. And what people don't think about, well, you know, I can volunteer 5-6 hours a week, no problem. But you mentioned people that live in the outlying areas. There's a lot of gasoline,
Yes.
wear and tear on a vehicle,
Yes.
hours beyond those that you're actually on the job volunteering. Some of these
Right.
people are driving an hour a day one way
right.
to volunteer. So when we had those financial restrictions, we lost a lot of that volunteerism. Have you found that we have now come back up to that pre-2005 or so strength with volunteers and that we've sort of weathered that storm?
You know, that's a good question. I think in a way we have, but I also think because we do live in such a rural area, it is expensive to be a volunteer, especially if you're going to patients' homes. You know, we service such a large area. We go all the way out to Ebro and Clarksville and Alpha, and you know, we're all over the place. And I have a volunteer that lives in Alford that drives to Bonifay to see a patient every other week he goes and visits him. I have another one that drives from Bonifay as a massage therapist volunteer, comes all the way over to Mariana and sees patients in Mariana. And so they're and the ironic thing about her is she's very young. She's younger than me, so she's very young. And so she works a job as a massage therapist, and on the side she gives back by volunteering for hospice patients. She came to me and said that she would like to be able to be there to help the patient relax and feel calm and soothed. And she does just that. She's remarkable. And she's got 3 young children at home. And on her one day off that she gets during the week when her kids are at school, she does that. She goes and volunteers. And so I'm hopeful that it's coming full circle again and that we're getting more volunteers and that people are catching on. One thing that has been great for Florida is the Bright Future scholarships. It's required that the kids do 100 hours of volunteer service before they graduate from high school. We cannot let anyone under the age of 18 go to a patient's home, but they can come in and do some clerical work. They can work events, things like that. So we try to utilize that and work together in a partnership and get those young people out there doing things that are important for their future.
Well, they say if you want something done, find a busy person.
Yeah.
And the meaning of that is basically that if somebody's lazy, you're not going to be able to cajole them into doing something anyway. If they don't want to do something, there's really no sense twisting their arm and getting them to volunteer because they're not going to do a good job.
That's exactly.
They're going to bail at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
Whereas you have a group, a very large group, thankfully, in this area of people who, I don't know how they do everything that they do, but they stay busy all the time.
Yes.
And we have a lot of those people in some of these fraternal organizations. I belong to Kiwanis. We see a lot of those people there, and they're chomping at the bit. They just love to go out and do these service projects. If somebody wants to get involved as that volunteer, what's the best course of action?
Well, what I would have them do is call me and talk to me. I always like to sit down with a potential volunteer first and get to know them a little bit, find out what they're looking to do for us, what we can do for them, because it's a two-way street. You know, they like to feel, you know, thanked and rewarded, and they should. And speaking of that, it is Volunteer Appreciation Week, and so that's what we're doing this week is we are thanking our volunteers and letting them know how important they are to us. And that, to me, isn't just Emerald Coast Hospice. I mean, I volunteer for a lot of things in the community as well, and that's how I got interested in the community when I moved here. Was I started volunteering for as many different things as I could, and it really made a large impact on me and my family's lives to get to know folks in the area. And so what they could do is they could call me at 850-526-3577 and ask for Margo Lamb. That's Lamb as in small sheep. There's no E on the end. And I would be happy to sit down with them and visit with them and find out what their interests are. And the great thing about Emerald Coast Hospice is that you can give as much or as little as you want. There's no requirement except to go through an orientation, a background study, fingerprinting, and then 4 hours of in-service a year. And that takes no time at all. And so it's a really great way to give back to your community. And I think there's a perception out there, oh my gosh, I could never volunteer for hospice. I could never sit with a dying person. Well, you don't have to. Not all of our patients are dying today. We have some patients that can go fishing from time to time if they're feeling good enough, and get out and go to church, things like that. They're looking for people to come in and sit and visit with them, or better yet, sit and visit with the caregiver. The caregiver may not have any socialization outside of that loved one because they can't get out. They can't leave the home. Caregiver relief is also another big one that we do. And then, like you mentioned, all the events that we partake in, the expos here for seniors, and the Sunland Fall Festival, and all these different events that we have, they can participate in all of those.
And it segues perfectly. It was down on my list, but I did want to address the caregivers. So often we completely forget about that caregiver. We say, well, they don't need volunteers or help in their home. They have a family member. People don't realize what a strain it is on that family member. First of all, they're living their normal life.
Right.
And then in addition to that, they're taking care of sometimes all the needs
That's right.
of a spouse or a loved one, a family member, whoever that happens to be. And as you point out, just having that one day off or that one evening off just makes such a difference, just to get a breath of fresh air.
It does. I mean, we actually have a volunteer in Mariana that went in. It was just a very sad situation. So this woman, it was her mother is on our service, and her husband died. So our volunteer came in and sat with her mother so the other lady, the daughter, could go to her husband's funeral. I mean, if no one else comes to sit with her, she can't go, and everyone else that she's close with wants to go to the service. So it's things like that that come up. I mean, this is real life, and so a situation like that is pretty special to know that a volunteer would come and spend, I mean, she sat there for 4 hours with that lady, and then she also has sat with that same family so that this lady could get to church, and so she'd continue to sit with her mother. So we have volunteers that sit on Sundays, and we don't like to call it a sitting service because that's not what it is. We like to be able to have them come in usually for just 1 or 2 hours and offer a little bit of relief, and then go on their way, because we don't want volunteer burnout, we call it.
Well, we would expect and certainly appreciate the fact that there is that vetting process. Anytime you're going to put somebody into somebody else's home, you want to be sure that you do that background check.
Yes.
And at this day and time, I think that's pretty well accepted and acknowledged by most anybody who wants to get involved,
Yes.
whether you're working with Boy Scouts or whomever. Such an important thing, something that we didn't always do, and so certainly is a good thing to do. With Volunteer Appreciation Week, I think that kind of jogs my memory. I'm not so sure it wasn't last year at this same time that you last came on the show.
Yeah.
I think you actually came on at that time to talk about just that.
Yeah.
You say you have revised your criteria for volunteers. You'd rather have quality versus quantity. You need both, obviously.
Yeah.
You need numbers to some extent.
Yes.
Where do you stand today? Are you in decent shape as far as volunteers? Are you in desperate need, or are you okay, but you certainly would like to refresh over time?
We certainly could use more volunteers, without a doubt. We're growing and expanding, and our area is so large that we cover the radius of the location of homes that it is a lot. It's a lot of driving for some of the volunteers, and there are some volunteers, like Nicole, that's our massage therapist. She can only go on Thursdays, and so things like that. And we're looking for volunteers that can cut hair. We're looking for volunteers that want to come in and read to patients. We're looking for volunteers to visit nursing homes. We'll take anyone that is really, truly passionate about giving back. And so, yes, absolutely, we are always recruiting for volunteers.
Just out of curiosity now, as far as the massage therapy, and then you mentioned cutting hair as a cosmetologist, would both of those trades, would that person have to be licensed for that in order to work under your auspices of hospice?
In order to do massage therapy, yes. They have to be a licensed and certified massage therapist. In order to cut someone's hair, no. If the patient and the patient's family agree that we're going to let Paul come and cut your hair, and you say, I've cut hair 10 times, and they say, I don't care, it's good, then no, they don't have to. But for anything like massage therapy, yes, they have to have a license or a certification.
Thanks for all that you guys do. People look at Emerald Coast Hospice and the services you provide, and sometimes don't drill down and see that huge job of coordinating and enlisting the volunteers who then carry on the work. Right. So what you do is certainly multi-layered, and in this case, talking about volunteers. Best to you, and for what it's worth, thank your volunteers for us. We appreciate all that you guys do. Do we pretty much cover what you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I think so. What do you think, Sunshine?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll see Sunshine back next time. She'll have her hair done and her makeup touched up by then.
Yeah, she'll look good.
Thanks for taking the time, and come back soon.
All right, thanks. I will.
Our guest today has been Margo Lamb from Emerald Coast Hospice, talking about National Volunteer Appreciation Week, which is this week. I dare say that we should pigeonhole it into a week. I think that every time that you run across somebody that volunteers, you should take that opportunity to say thank you. We do take the week to officially acknowledge it, but my goodness, organizations such as Emerald Coast Hospice simply couldn't exist, nor do all the good works that they do without that huge pool of volunteers. If you yourself are a volunteer, if you volunteer for Emerald Coast Hospice or any other organization, hats off, thank you, and happy National Volunteer Appreciation Week. We do appreciate everything you do, and we'll be right back.